I grew up in Greenwich, Connecticut, a place where multi-million-dollar mansions stand behind perfectly trimmed hedges and sleek cars glide down streets like toys on display. To outsiders, Greenwich was paradise. But for me, it was a cage of silent judgments and unspoken hierarchies. My name is Brett Langford, 36 years old, the eldest son in a family that never really saw me. My father, Edward, was the founder of Langford Medical Supplies, a man with salt and pepper hair, razor-sharp eyes, and a smile that appeared only when speaking of money, or my younger brother, Gavin. My mother, Catherine, was softer in tone, yet just as distant, always standing behind my father, nodding along as if she had no thoughts of her own. Then there was Gavin, 4 years younger than me, the shining star of the Langford family, the child who seemed to bring luck just by existing. I don't know when I first realized I was different in their eyes. Maybe it was at the dinner table when I tried to talk about the painting I'd been praised for in school, only to be cut off so my father could ask Gavin about basketball practice. Maybe it was when I saw my mother smoothing Gavin's hair and smiling at him in a way she never once did with me. Or perhaps it began before I even understood the world. My father was a superstitious man beneath his business logic, and he often called me the unlucky star of the family. The story went like this. After my birth on a rainy October day in 1989, his company lost contracts, lawsuits piled in, and within 2 years, he lost half his fortune. He whispered to my mother late at night that my arrival had cursed the family. Yet when Gavin was born, years later, a lucrative contract appeared as if from nowhere, and the business soared again. My father declared Gavin his lucky charm, the boy who carried prosperity with him, while I was the reminder of decline. It showed in everything. When I was 8, I spent hours building a wooden train model in shop class, eager to show it off at one of my father's lavish backyard parties. I held it up to him proudly, but he barely glanced at it before turning to Gavin, clapping his shoulder and telling a guest how sure he was that Gavin would make the basketball team. I stood there with my model feeling like I was disappearing into air. My mother's indifference was quieter, but deeper. When I scraped my knees falling from my bike, she bandaged me quickly and told me not to fuss, but when Gavin had a slight cold, she skipped work to cook soup and sit by his bedside. I didn't envy Gavin at first. I just longed to be seen. But as the years went on, the house felt like it had only one open door, and it was always Gavin who walked through. So I became obedient. I studied hard, excelled in school, not because I loved learning, but because I thought achievements would make them notice me. I topped my classes, won debate competitions, earned scholarships. But none of it lingered in their minds. Gavin could score a single basket in a game, and it would be celebrated with a family dinner. At 12, my father demanded I attend St. George's Academy, an elite private school filled with arrogant children of the wealthy families. I hated it, but he said it was the place where I'd become useful to the family. I complied, earned awards, and again waited for a proud glance that never came. At 16, I wanted to study creative writing, but my father said business was the only path. Writing would never feed me, he said, and after Boston University I would join the company whether I liked it or not. I buried my dream deep inside and obeyed again. Boston University was a long, gray chapter in my life. I studied business without passion, joined clubs to strengthen my resume, and secretly wrote stories at night. I sent some to magazines under pseudonyms, but I never dared to tell my parents. Even when I graduated with honors, my father skipped the ceremony because he was busy taking Gavin to tour colleges. My mother sent a card that read, "Your parents are proud of you." I stared at it, wondering if she really meant it. After college, my father placed me in project management at Langford Medical Supplies. I hated it, the sterile contracts, the cold competition, but I convinced myself that if I worked hard enough, he would finally see me. I worked 12-hour days, created proposals, and once even pitched a marketing campaign based on storytelling. My father dismissed it with a cold glance and said Gavin would take the company forward when he finished school. Gavin, who hadn't yet graduated, was already the chosen heir. I pushed on, swallowing the hurt, but deep inside I began to wonder if my father had been right all along. Maybe I truly was the unlucky star. Maybe nothing I did would ever matter. That belief settled in me like a shadow, until one day when I was 27, my father summoned me to his office for a request that would change the course of my life forever. When I entered my father's office that day, I felt like a boy being called to the principal instead of a 27-year-old man who had already given up so much for the family. He sat behind his polished desk, his voice steady but commanding as he told me the company was at a critical juncture. Sterling Healthcare. Their biggest client had to be secured. I expected him to ask me to handle a contract or present a proposal, but what came next froze my blood. He wanted me to marry Abigail Sterling, the CEO's daughter. He spoke as if this was the only logical path, brushing off the idea of love, as if it were childish nonsense. To him, marriage was a transaction, and I was nothing but a tool to secure the family's future. I tried to resist telling him I couldn't marry someone I didn't love, but his anger exploded like a storm. He mocked me for thinking I had a choice, reminded me I was a bad omen, and told me I'd never contributed anything meaningful. For the first time, I pushed back. I told him I wasn't his property, that I had done everything he demanded, but would not sacrifice my future like this. His fury cut deep, and he stripped me of everything in one blow, my job, my home, even the car I drove. He said if I wanted freedom, I could start from nothing and never come back begging. The next day, I was left with a small bag, a few $100s, and a savings account with barely a few thousand. I had no job, no family, and no direction, except the one dream I had buried for so long, writing. I rented a shabby room, worked as a waiter by day, and wrote at night. I submitted story after story, only to receive rejection after rejection. The words, "not a fit," became familiar wounds. At times I wondered if my father had been right, if I was indeed cursed, but I kept writing because it was all I had left that was truly mine. My mother called once, but not to offer comfort. She scolded me for disappointing my father, told me Abigail had been my chance to make things right, and reminded me that Gavin would never fail them the way I had. She hung up before I could explain, and I sat staring at my unfinished manuscript more alone than I had ever felt. Meanwhile, my family's life carried on without me. Gavin married the daughter of a wealthy Manhattan family. Their wedding celebrated as the event of the year, while my name was erased from conversations and even family introductions. Yet in the depths of that loneliness, I found a sliver of light. I joined a small writing group in Greenwich and met Clara, a freelance journalist with untidy curls and a warm smile. She read my short stories and told me I had talent. Her encouragement pushed me to keep trying. With her help, I published my first article in a local magazine, shining a spotlight on the invisible workers of Greenwich, the people who kept the town running while the wealthy lived in their mansions. Holding that magazine, seeing my name in print, I felt for the first time that I existed outside of my father's shadow. Still, survival was hard. I picked up delivery shifts at night, driving through streets lined with mansions I once called neighbors, their glowing windows reminding me of everything I had lost. But I wrote through exhaustion, pouring my pain into stories and into a novel about a man trying to escape the shadow of his family. Publishers told me it was too dark, too unmarketable, and each rejection cut deeper. I almost gave up, until one night I stumbled onto writers sharing work online, building audiences without waiting for publishers. I decided to try. I created an anonymous account under the name Shadow Scribe and posted a story about a boy growing up in his younger brother's shadow. I didn't expect much, but by morning it had hundreds of likes and shares. People commented that they saw themselves in my words, that I made them feel understood. For the first time in my life, strangers were listening. I wrote more, and my audience grew. From dozens to hundreds to thousands, people followed me waiting for each story. They told me I had given them hope. I was still waiting tables and making deliveries, but when I wrote, I felt alive. By 29, one of my stories went viral, reaching millions after being shared by a well-known journalist. My words had traveled further than I ever thought possible. Readers called me shadow scribe, sent me messages that my stories helped them endure their own families and struggles. It gave me purpose beyond my pain, and for the first time, I no longer felt invisible. Then, at 31, an email arrived from Horizon Press, an independent publisher in New York. They had discovered my novel online and wanted to publish it. I thought it was a scam until I sat across from their editor in a small cafe, who told me, "Your story has life. We want to bring it to readers worldwide." At 32, my novel In the Shadow of Stars was published. It wasn't a blockbuster, but it sold thousands of copies, enough for critics to take notice and for a local newspaper to call me a rising star from Greenwich. Holding that book in my hands, I felt like I had finally proven I wasn't the unlucky star my father had named me. I was Brett Langford, a writer. By the time I turned 34, I was no longer scraping by with odd jobs. My book In the Shadow of Stars had sold over 10,000 copies. And though modest by bestseller standards, it was enough to free me from waiting tables and delivery shifts. I lived in a small apartment on the outskirts of New York, a simple place with one bedroom, a kitchen, and a balcony overlooking a tree-lined street. It wasn't luxurious, but it was mine, paid for with the money I earned through my words. I had saved nearly $400,000 from book royalties, articles, and speaking engagements at literary events. For the first time in my life, I felt secure. I thought the chapter with my family was closed. I hadn't spoken to my father or mother in years, not since the night they cast me out, but their voices still haunted me in quiet moments. Then, one morning, sipping coffee on my balcony and reviewing the manuscript of my second novel, my phone buzzed. A news alert flashed across the screen. Langford Medical Supplies declares bankruptcy after years of losses. My father's empire, the company that had been the foundation of our family's pride, and the reason he had tried to control my life, was gone. I scrolled through the article, reading how outdated technology, poor management, and the loss of the Sterling contract had crippled the business. My father was quoted, still resolute, still insisting he had done his best. A part of me wanted to feel vindicated, to think of his downfall as justice for the years he called me a bad omen. But instead, I felt only emptiness, like the closing of a long, bitter chapter without a proper ending. Weeks later, my phone rang with a Greenwich area code. Against my better judgment, I answered. My mother's voice trembled on the line, older and more fragile than I remembered. She told me the mansion had been sold to cover debts, that she and my father were living in a small rented apartment, and that times were hard. She said she had heard about my success as a writer and that perhaps I could help them. Her words struck me like a blade. For years I had begged for their acknowledgement, and now, after silence and rejection, she reached out only because they needed something. Still, the part of me that longed for family listened. Soon after, my father called. His voice was sharp, but weaker than I remembered, a trace of weariness beneath the command. He told me about a penthouse in downtown Greenwich, selling for $900,000 a steal, as he put it. He insisted I buy it for them, saying it would not only secure their comfort, but also allow me to make amends for everything I had ruined. That phrase cut into me more than anything else. Amends. As though my existence had been a mistake I was expected to fix. For nights I couldn't sleep. I had $400,000 saved. But buying that penthouse meant draining everything and borrowing $500,000 from the bank. I didn't need a penthouse. I was content with my small apartment. Yet I imagined my mother in a cramped rental, and despite my father's words, I couldn't fully turn my back. I convinced myself that helping them was the right thing to do, even if it left me in debt. I contacted the bank, signed the papers, and purchased the penthouse. When I handed the keys to my mother, she hugged me for the first time in years, her eyes filled with tears as she whispered, "Thank you." But the emptiness in my chest told me the truth. I had done it not for love returned, but to silence my guilt. Months passed and they settled into the penthouse while I worked tirelessly to meet the loan payments. One evening, my father called to thank me, his tone softer than it had ever been. For a fleeting moment, I felt I had gained a sliver of his approval. But as the call ended, I overheard him speaking to a neighbor. He said I had only bought the penthouse to show superiority, that I remained a bad omen who had ruined his company, and that Gavin was still his true pride. Hearing those words shattered the fragile hope I had carried all my life. I sat in my small apartment, tears blurring my vision, realizing nothing I did would ever be enough. I had sacrificed my dreams, my money, and now even my future security to help them, yet I was still the curse, still unwanted. It was in that moment I finally understood my parents would never change. No matter how much I gave, they would never see me, never love me the way they loved Gavin. And if I wanted peace, I had to stop trying. The night I overheard my father calling me a bad omen for the 1,000th time, I sat motionless in my apartment with my manuscript open but untouched. All the sacrifices I had made, the $900,000 penthouse, the $500,000 bank loan, the years of debt and exhaustion, suddenly felt like chains I had willingly wrapped around myself. For so long I had thought, if I just gave enough, if I endured enough, one day they would look at me with pride. But that moment made me understand with painful clarity I had been chasing an illusion. The next morning, desperate for clarity, I called Clara, the one person who had never once made me feel invisible. We met at our usual cafe in Greenwich sunlight, filtering through the window onto the worn wooden tables. I told her everything, the phone call, my father's words, the hollow ache in my chest. Clara listened quietly, her hand resting gently on mine. When I finished, she looked into my eyes and said, "Brett, you've done more than enough. You don't need to prove anything anymore. If you want to live freely, you have to cut the chain that ties you to them." Her words settled deep into my heart, and for the first time, I considered the unthinkable, selling the penthouse. The thought terrified me. That apartment symbolized all the years of trying, all the hope I had poured into being acknowledged. Selling it meant severing the last tie to my family, but it also meant finally reclaiming my freedom. I contacted a real estate agent named Susan, who assured me the property would sell quickly. She listed it for $950,000, and within weeks, a young couple from Manhattan offered $980,000. I accepted without hesitation. For the first time in years, I felt as if a boulder had been lifted from my chest. But my father found out. He called me that evening, his voice filled with the same rage he had unleashed when I was 27. He accused me of betrayal, of throwing my parents onto the street, of being ungrateful. The words no longer shook me the way they once did. I told him calmly that I had already given them everything I could, that I had invested $400,000 of my own savings, borrowed $500,000 more, and sacrificed years of peace to keep them comfortable. "I am not your property," I said, my voice firm, though my hands trembled. "I have the right to live my life. You should ask the son you are proud of, not me." For once I did not falter under his fury. I hung up the phone, my heart pounding, not with fear, but with a new kind of fire freedom. My mother called soon after, her voice frail and pleading. She begged me to reconsider, said I could not abandon my family, that I was their son. Her words, once enough to fill me with guilt, no longer pierced me. I told her gently that I had already given more than anyone could ask, and that I needed to choose myself now. She fell silent, then ended the call. I knew she did not understand, but for the first time I realized I didn't need her to. 2 weeks later, the penthouse was sold. I paid off the $500,000 loan, and for the first time in years, I was free of financial chains. Over $400,000 remained money I chose to invest in myself, a better laptop, courses to sharpen my writing, a quiet trip to Maine for inspiration. My parents moved out of the penthouse, and though I did not know where they went, I felt no guilt in not asking. That chapter of my life had ended. During that time, I finished my second novel, Out of the Dark. It told the story of a man who found light in his wounds, who discovered that breaking away from a toxic past was the only way to truly heal. When it was published at 35, it didn't sell as widely as my debut, but readers praised it deeply. They said it gave them courage. One critic wrote, "This book is proof that even in darkness, there is always a way to find light." Those words were worth more to me than any number on a sales chart. Clara and I began dating officially. She became my anchor, the first to read my drafts, the one who reminded me when I doubted myself that I had already overcome more than most people ever could. One night on my balcony, she said softly, "Brett, you're not just a writer. You're the strongest man I know. You stood up alone and still found a way to shine." Her words healed something deep inside me that my parents never had. I realized then that family wasn't just the people who shared your blood. It was the ones who stood beside you with love and respect. By the time my second novel reached readers, I began to realize my story wasn't just mine. Every letter I received, every comment online, was proof that my journey belonged to others who had also grown up unseen in their own homes. My Shadow Scribe account grew into a community of more than 200,000 followers, people who told me my words had given them strength. For the first time, I felt as if the years of pain had been transformed into something meaningful. I no longer hid behind the anonymous pen name. I began using my real name, speaking openly about my past and the battles I had fought within my family. At book signings and events, readers approached me with tears in their eyes, telling me their own stories of rejection and struggle. Each encounter reminded me that even though I had been born into a family that wished I hadn't existed, I had built a new family through my words, one of strangers who saw me and respected me. Clara stood by my side through it all. She didn't love me because of my books or my followers. She loved me as Brett, a man with scars and dreams. We spoke often about the future, a small house in the suburbs, perhaps children one day, mornings filled with coffee and evenings spent creating side by side, me with my stories, her with her articles. The life I had once thought impossible began to feel within reach. But the shadow of my past wasn't easy to escape. Sometimes late at night I would remember the words I overheard my father say to his neighbor that he wished I had never been born. The sting lingered like an old scar. I had to remind myself again and again that their blindness didn't define me, that I was no longer that boy standing in the backyard hoping for a glance of approval. To heal, I began writing essays on my blog about toxic families, boundaries, and the right to choose oneself. Thousands of people read the many leaving comments saying my words had given them permission to stop chasing impossible love. In teaching others, I was also teaching myself. Forgiveness didn't mean erasing what happened or reconciling with those who hurt me. Forgiveness meant laying down the burden of resentment so it no longer controlled me. I forgave my parents not because they deserved it, but because I didn't want to spend the rest of my life carrying their shadows. Still, forgiveness didn't mean opening the door again. I didn't call them, didn't write, didn't try to reconnect. I set boundaries not as punishment, but as protection. I heard through whispers in Greenwich that they now lived in a small apartment and relied partly on Gavin. But for once, I felt no guilt in staying away. I'd spent my entire life giving until it nearly destroyed me. Choosing myself was not cruelty, it was survival. One afternoon, I was invited to speak at a literary conference in New York. Standing on that stage before a room full of young writers, readers, and strangers who had come to hear my story, I felt a rush of clarity. I spoke about the boy who grew up in his brother's shadow, who believed he was cursed because his father told him so, who gave everything for a glimpse of love that never came. I told them about the penthouse, the debt, the moment I finally realized nothing I did would change my parents. I told them about setting boundaries, about building a family from people who see and respect you. Family isn't just blood, I said, my voice trembling with emotion. Family is the people who love you without asking you to sacrifice yourself. And if you are in a toxic family that makes you feel like you are never enough, you have the right to say no. You have the right to protect your happiness. That isn't selfish, it is necessary. The room was silent for a moment, then filled with applause. Faces in the crowd were tearful eyes, shining with the kind of recognition I had once longed for in my own home. Afterward, a young woman approached me, clutching a copy of Out of the Dark. She told me she hadn't spoken to her mother in 2 years because she always felt worthless around her. But today, she said, her voice shaking, I'm going to call her, not to reconcile, but to say I need space for myself. I hugged her and whispered, You are stronger than you know. In her eyes, I saw the reflection of my own journey. That night, I sat on my balcony with Clara, telling her about the conference, the people I met, and the young woman's courage. Clara wrapped her arms around me and kissed my cheek. You're changing the world, Brett, she said softly. One story at a time. I looked at the stars above the quiet street and realized she was right. My words were no longer just for me, they were lanterns for others walking through the same darkness I had known. The more I shared my story, the lighter my heart became. For years I had carried the weight of invisibility, the sting of rejection, and the crushing belief that I was somehow a curse. Now, standing on stages and publishing essays, I found myself turning that pain into a source of light. People who read my words or heard me speak often came up afterward with tears in their eyes, thanking me for putting into language what they had never dared to say aloud. It was as if by telling my truth, I gave them permission to tell their own. At home, life began to take on a new rhythm. Clara and I made plans for the future, not grand, lavish plans like the ones my parents had always envisioned for Gavin, but simple ones rooted in love and respect. We dreamed about buying a small house in the suburbs, perhaps with a porch and a little yard where we could sit on warm evenings. We spoke of traveling for inspiration, of building a life filled with creativity and quiet joy. Every day with her reminded me of what real family felt like, acceptance without condition. Yet there were still nights when memories intruded. Sometimes I woke in the dark with my father's words echoing in my ears, his voice declaring that I had ruined everything, that I was a bad omen. In those moments, Clara would take my hand and whisper that I was not defined by him, that I was enough. Slowly, those memories began to lose their power. The scars remained, but they no longer dictated who I was. As my platform grew, I received messages from readers across the world. Some told me they had left toxic households, others that they had finally spoken up after years of silence. A father once wrote to me that reading In the Shadow of Stars helped him realize that he had been treating his own eldest son unfairly and that he was trying to change. That letter made me weep, for it was the acknowledgement I had never received from my own father, but at least it meant my story had spared someone else from the same fate. I continued writing, pouring myself into my third book, one centered on forgiveness and boundaries. It was not a story about reconciliation, but about release, the kind that allows you to walk away without hate. While working on it, I often sat on my balcony in the evenings reflecting on how far I had come. The boy who once stared at the ceiling wishing he had never been born was now a man who helped others believe they deserved to live fully. There were times I thought of my parents. I heard through whispers that they still lived in a modest apartment, that Gavin was the one supporting them now. I never reached out. Not because I wished them harm, but because I finally understood that some relationships, no matter how deeply you wish for them to heal, will never change. The only way forward was to let go. One evening after finishing a speaking engagement, I returned home to Clara, waiting with dinner and a smile. As we ate, she looked at me with that warm steadiness I had come to rely on and said, "Brett, do you realize what you've done? You took everything they said would destroy you and turned it into a reason to rise. You are living proof that we don't have to be what our families call us." Her words stayed with me long after the dishes were cleared away. That night, sitting at my laptop, I began drafting a blog post that would later become one of my most shared pieces. If you feel unseen or unloved in your family, I wrote, know that you are not alone. You have the right to protect yourself, to set boundaries, and to build a life that honors who you are. Walking away does not mean you are selfish. It means you are choosing survival. And in survival, you will find your true family, the people who love you for you. When I pressed publish, I felt a peace I had never known before. I had finally learned to stop chasing what would never come, and instead, to live for what was real. My story, once a source of shame, had become my greatest strength. In the months that followed, my life became calmer, steadier, and full of meaning in ways I had never imagined. Claire and I took small trips for inspiration, quiet towns in Maine, bustling streets in New York, the serene beaches of Cape Cod. I carried my notebook everywhere, jotting down fragments of stories while she scribbled ideas for her articles. We were building a life not on wealth or appearances, but on love and truth. I sometimes thought back to the Langford mansion, to the boy I'd been holding a wooden train model, hoping for a proud glance that never came. That boy had once believed his existence was a curse. But now, years later, I understood that my life had never been a burden. It had been a journey toward freedom. My parents had defined me as unlucky, but the truth was, I had created my own luck when I walked away from their expectations. At 36, I looked out from my apartment balcony at the golden light of dusk and realized I had finally escaped their shadow. My words had touched lives, my love with Clara was real, and my future was mine to shape. I no longer needed their approval. I had learned the most important lesson of all: we cannot force people to see us, but we can choose to see ourselves. Forgiveness, I discovered, was not about reconciliation. It was about release. I forgave them not because they deserved it, but because I deserved peace. By letting go, I freed myself from the endless hunger for their love. And in doing so, I learned something I wish I could tell that little boy standing in the backyard years ago. You are enough exactly as you are. To anyone listening who has grown up in the shadows of a family that never saw them, remember this: your worth is not measured by their blindness. You do not have to keep proving yourself to those who refuse to acknowledge you. You have the right to set boundaries, to walk away, and to build a new family out of love, respect, and acceptance. In that choice lies freedom. If my story resonates with you, I hope you'll stay connected. Please like this video, share it with someone who might need to hear it, subscribe for more stories like this, and leave a comment about your own journey. I would love to hear it.